الضمير ما هي وما هي أهميتها وما مدى فعالية قراراتها وما هي الأسس القانونية التي ترتكز عليها؟ محاكم الضمير من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. جرائم ترتكب وحروب تشن، حروب إبادة جماعية وعقوبات، سجون سرية وحصار، مجازر بحق الدول والشعوب ارتكبتها الإدارات الأمريكية المتعاقبة وحلفاؤها لعقود من الزمن. القوى الإمبريالية التوسعية دائما تفلت من العقاب. منظمات المجتمع المدني والجمعيات الأهلية والناشطين في حركات التحرر العالمية وحركات حقوق الإنسان ومناهضة العولمة والعدوان والاحتلال لطالما نادوا بضرورة تطبيق اتفاقيات جنيف الأربع لتنظيم العلاقات الدولية في حالة الحرب وملاحقة مجرمي الحرب ومرتكبي الجرائم ضد الإنسانية. محاكم ضمير قامت في أكثر من عاصمة لمقاضاة المجرمين وملاحقتهم ومن يدفعهم. نائب رئيس الاتحاد الهندي للمحامين التي كانت إحدى أبرز القضاة في عدد من المحاكم الدولية كمحكمة طوكيو الدولية لجرائم الحرب في أفغانستان، وضمن فريق الادعاء في محكمة الشعب من أجل العراق في 2005 في اسطنبول، ومحكمة كوالالمبور لمقاضاة الرئيس الأمريكي الأسبق جورج بوش الابن ورئيس وزراء بريطانيا الأسبق توني بلير بارتكاب جرائم حرب ضد العراق وشعبه، القاضية نيلوفر بهاغوات. ماذا تخبرنا عن محاكم الضمير وماهيتها القانونية والحقوقية؟ وهل وضعت قراراتها حيز التنفيذ؟ وماذا عن الأسس القانونية لما يسمى الحرب على الإرهاب؟ Professor Nilüfer Bhagwat, Attorney Vice President of Indian Association of Lawyers, welcome to The Inside. Ma'am, to start, I want to ask you here about this conscious tribunal. What does it exactly mean? How important is it?
In a situation in the world where international law had collapsed, the United Nations organizations, the Security Council in particular, and also the General Assembly failed to intervene in a situation where genocide was being committed by aggression and the military occupation of countries from Afghanistan to Iraq to Palestine to Somalia to Yemen, among other countries. It was absolutely necessary for academicians, jurists, and lawyers to hold these tribunals, to inform the world that international institutions had collapsed. The International Criminal Court, which had been established with great fanfare, had granted under its charter impunity to US and NATO forces, and civilian population of these countries were being killed. The entire civilian infrastructure was destroyed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Yemen. It is ongoing. In Syria, militants have been sent in, so-called militants. It is nothing but a terrorist war against Syria. In these circumstances, it is absolutely necessary for us to hold up what the laws of war, what international law is, what the UN Charter really is, what are the laws of peace and war, and how and in what manner have they been violated.
Now, this tribunal, it seems, and we know that it's a political one, it's not a legal one. So what can it achieve?
The fact is that these tribunals, I would not consider them political. I would consider these tribunals tribunals of conscience. It is true that they have no enforcement powers.
Legally
Legally speaking, it is true that they do not have enforcement powers. But in a situation where satanic forces had taken over the whole world order, it was essential to bring home to the conscience of mankind as to what the rule of law internationally is supposed to be, and how every act and every decision, whether in the foreign chancelleries of these countries or on the military field, is anti-humanity. So I would categorize these tribunals as tribunals of conscience, not political tribunals, because we were searching for the truth, and what we wanted to hold out before the people of this country is that this is the truth of what is happening when the corporate media refuse to focus on the tremendous sufferings of people all over the world, which is a violation of the principles of humanity on the basis of which international law is based.
Right, and even the international community, ma'am, asserts that whenever a country or a land is occupied, it's the right of the people to resist in every means they can. Yet, they are branded, those people and those sides who are resistance are branded as terrorists, or whatever they are doing in a form of resistance as terrorism.
Before the United Nations was taken over by a unipolar world order, and specifically by the United States, France, the United Kingdom, among other permanent members of the Security Council, it is by a resolution of the General Assembly that the right of self-determination and the right to resist occupation forces has been upheld, that every resistance force is entitled to oppose the occupation of their homeland and their country. And to refer and to call them as terrorism was absolutely not in conformity with what the law as expressed by the General Assembly is. And this was also one of the objectives of the tribunals, to reveal that the resistance forces are justified in opposing war and occupation.
Right. Now, Articles 33 and 51 of the Geneva Conventions forbid the use of collective punishment and other forms of terrorizing civilians. Isn't what took place recently against the Gazans in Gaza, and not only recently, but before, even in 2008, 2009, and what took place against the people of Lebanon back in 2006 by Israel, isn't that a form of collective punishment?
It was a clear case of Israel, the Zionist entity which is Israel, which is a military outpost of the region. You cannot call it a country in the normal sense of the word. It is colonization, it's a military outpost. Because if you trace the history of the creation of Israel, you will find that it was created as a military outpost primarily of Britain, followed by the United States, followed by NATO powers. And Zionism is an alliance with US imperialism and NATO forces. Now, if you consider the casualties on the ground in that war, it is clear that 90% and more, I would say 99% of those killed in those wars were civilians.
Sure.
The entire attack was aimed against, in fact, the objective was to terrorize the civilian population. As far as the Palestinians were concerned, the objective was to remove them from their homeland, whatever is left of their homeland. And as far as the Lebanese people were concerned, it was to terrorize the Lebanese people, to make them stop the resistance, to stop the assistance, whatever positions they had.
You know, it seems that Israel is always above the law, above the international law when it comes to its practices, because also the separation wall in the West Bank and occupied Palestine is also, according to Geneva Conventions, Article 49, is a war crime.
The General Assembly referred this whole question of apartheid the creation of the walls, which imposes apartheid.
The apartheid wall,
was referred to the walls. The whole issue of walls and checkposts was referred to the International Court of Justice, and they opined that it is absolutely illegal in violation of the UN Charter, violation of international humanitarian law, that people have no access, the Palestinian people no access to water, to their agricultural land, to employment, to health facilities. They have been cut off from every civic source or public utility. And the whole world has been watching, but I want to emphasize here.
Yes.
As you know, the Zionist entity is powerful because it controls the banks and financial institutions, which are now declining. So this is the reason why they are above the law, because they have been actually browbeating financially and economically several governments to toe their line. Through the governments, they are operating, these Zionist bankers operate through the United States government, through Britain, through the government of France, and through the NATO powers. And in particular, after the capitulation of the Soviet Union and its leadership, they feel that they are absolutely above any kind of law or regulation. And that is why resistance is the only answer in the region.
Right. As a legal expert, Professor Bhagwat, now the war on terror was declared back in the year 2001, practically after the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. There are, however, questions here about the legal basis of this war on terror. I mean, it could be more of an emotional concept, a metaphor related to the feelings of people, but does it have a legal basis?
It had no legal basis, it has no legal basis. And all over the world now there is a public reaction, and the United States government, the NATO forces and the Zionist entity of Israel, they have lost any credibility, they've lost the propaganda war. As I sit here, I can tell you that there is no respectability for this position anywhere. They declared a war on terror because they had no enemy. The war on terror is nothing more than a war of enslavement of people and takeover of economic resources from country to country. To give you a recent example of Iraq and Libya,
Please do.
The entire national budget, the gold, the bank deposits of both Iraq and Libya in foreign banks as well as in their own banks has been taken over. And now the commentary on these wars is that these were wars of resources, not confined to any one country, and therefore they use the word terror with a view to use the corporate media to brainwash the world that this is a war against terrorism, whereas it was a war of terrorism with the objective of taking over the financial and national resources and to continue the dollar as the reserve currency.
So this was just a pretext as a casus belli, for example, to launch this war against this part of this region?
It was only a pretext, and people all over the world saw through it, and therefore we decided to initiate the World Tribunal movement to further expose.
Right. Professor Bhagwat, we're going now to stop for a short break, and then after the break we'll talk more about these conscious tribunals and the war crimes pursued by the US, the consecutive US administrations in this part of the world. A short break and we'll be back with The Inside. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Inside with Professor Nilofar Bhagwat from India. Welcome back, ma'am. Now, allow me here to move on to something very important. We need to highlight it, and I know you have your own stance concerning this issue, which is the drone war. They say on the 25th of October 2012, Ben Emerson, QC, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, announced that a UN investigation unit would be established early next year, quote, to inquire into individual drone attacks and other forms of targeted killing conducted in counter-terrorism operations. Does this give the US, under the banner of protecting their own civilians and this so-called war on terror, to liquidate and kill other civilians across Pakistan, Yemen and Somalia?
If you consider the on-the-ground situation, namely the people who have died in the drone attacks. Once again, 99% of those who have died in the drone attacks, a most merciless form of warfare, illegal, are civilians, whether in Yemen, whether in Somalia, or whether in Pakistan. The Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War and the Hague Conventions of 1907 absolutely prohibit any kind of attack on civilians. The so-called collateral damage theory.
And even the media is hushed on this issue. They don't highlight it a lot.
The media, because it is controlled by the very corporations, these are channels which actually are justifying war, and they themselves are war criminals. I'm sorry to say that television media has played a very negative role in justifying this kind of warfare, and they themselves should be hauled up as having committed war crimes, as they have justified these kind of attacks, apart from the fact that these governments have given these orders. Recently, a report was submitted from Pakistan that 336 sorties, drones were launched on Pakistan.
Right.
And in 99% of the cases, it is men, women, and children. Now, what the people of the world need to know is that the people from the tribal areas of Pakistan, from northwest Pakistan and on the borders of the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, they've stopped sending their children to school because they do not know which child is going to be killed in the drone attacks. This is the reality of the situation, and there is no body to bury even after drone warfare.
Right.
Limbs are found, flung in far-flung regions. People have not even been able to put a body together to bury them. And the reaction in these countries, whether it's Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, this is evidence to the world of what kind of democracy, what kind of rule of law, and what kind of freedom is being held out to the world. Is being held out to the world. I would say that the countries resorting to drone warfare are neither republics nor democracies. It is absolutely prohibited. These are very serious war crimes.
How could one confront such activities from a legal perspective, so to say?
From a legal perspective.
Is it only through those conscious tribunals, or do we have to resort to another means, legally speaking?
The conscience tribunals serve only a limited purpose. And that too, if they bring forward the true facts. Some tribunals have performed a good task in exposing. Other tribunals have concealed more than they have revealed. However, they are only tribunals of conscience to create the right kind of moral reaction and the political reaction to the issues. The dilemma that the world confronts is that not a single government or a country can invoke either the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court rather.
Right.
Is because as far as the International Criminal Court is concerned, by its charter, it has given impunity to the United States and to those countries who have not signed. But on the other hand, there are countries like the UK which are signatories. And I urge the citizens of the countries who are signatories and who are allies of the United States to go and invoke the provisions of the International Criminal Court. Because as you know, in the case of Nicaragua, when the Nicaraguan ports were mined, the issue was taken by Nicaragua to the International Court of Justice, and there was a judgment which was given by the International Court at Hague. But quite frankly, to be honest with you, it is when there is resistance on the ground. It is when there is only when there is resistance on the ground.
You mean armed resistance?
Unfortunately, yes, because the people of these countries who face occupation will have to resort to various kind of strategies, not restricted only to armed resistance, to all kinds of resistance, both in the international arena, within their countries. It is important for them to organize their people And it may not be possible for only an individual country to do so. What I would argue for is that a regional resistance of several countries in the region, in the Horn of Africa, to West Asia, extending towards Central Asia, to South Asia, a broader alliance is necessary in collaboration with all those countries and peoples who stand for peace,
right,
and for international security, to resist this.
Yes. Let me here just go back to when you served as a judge with the Tokyo International Tribunal for War Crimes in Afghanistan. You wrote in your decision that you found George W. Bush guilty for waging war against Afghanistan and the Afghani people. In addition, Judge Bhagwat, you served as a prosecutor of George W. Bush at the People's Tribunal in Iraq in 2005, held in Istanbul. Defense counsel alleged that this is the defense counsel in the Kuala Lumpur Tribunal, which was also trying Bush and Blair. He alleged that your participation in these various efforts, and due to the opinions you have issued, that you cannot be fair in the Kuala Lumpur proceedings, and you left the chamber accordingly.
Yes.
What happened?
Well, the legal expression for
yes,
the stand which I took as a reaction to the submissions of the defense counsel was that I recused. Because in the traditions of law, if such a stand is taken, it is open to the judge to continue, or it is open to the judge to recuse. The reason I did so was because I did not want the proceedings to be questioned in any manner. But strictly speaking, I was a judge at the Afghanistan Tribunal. The aggression against Afghanistan is a totally different issue from the Iraq war, completely different. And at Istanbul, I was not a formal prosecutor at all. There were presentations being made. It was Richard Falk who was the chief prosecutor.
The chief prosecutor of
Whereas
the tribunal.
others who were addressing the Istanbul Tribunal, we were making presentations on different issues. And I was making a presentation on the privatization of war. It was my presentation before the Istanbul jury. It was a jury, not a formal tribunal. It was my presentation that the war against Iraq is a war which is determined by the banks and financial institutions and private companies, and that whereas the military forces of governments are being used by these countries in an alliance for war, the real war is being dictated by these financial entities to take over the resources of their country. So I was not a formal prosecutor.
Right.
And the charge was not justified. However, it appeared that there were some individuals who were associated with the KL Tribunal who were not too happy at the fact that I had expertise in this area, primarily because of my study and research in international law.
And your participation in various
and
tribunals.
the kind of experience I had gathered. Therefore, they felt that my presence would result in a much bigger exposure of what had happened in Iraq than the limited exposure of jurists who belong, or those judges who belong to the strictly Anglo-Saxon system of jurisprudence, which bases its judgments not on the wider issues on the ground, but on restricted issues. And I myself feel that the Kuala Lumpur Tribunal on Iraq should not have restricted itself only to the aggression against Iraq and torture, which were well known. The more serious factor were the objectives of the aggression in Iraq to take over the entire economic and financial resources of Iraq, the destruction of the entire infrastructure of Iraq to give contracts to the Western companies, and the fact that genocide had been committed in Iraq of an unprecedented kind in the post-Second World War period, where a whole country was devastated merely to take over its financial resources. I felt that those were very, very important issues, apart from the fact that the nature of weapons used, which are genocidal, which will affect generations of women and children in Iraq, particularly in areas like Basra and Fallujah, where depleted uranium, white phosphorus
was used against
and
the civilians.
whole range of weaponry has been used, tested, and it has been said that the neutron bomb, which keeps the infrastructure going but devastates people, was used at the Baghdad airport.
Right.
This is an area which has to be further investigated and for which evidence needs to be led.
Last question, but briefly, if I may ask, you were one of the prime participants in the Maryam boat that was supposed to break the siege against Gaza. Why didn't this initiative materialize? And you actually came to Lebanon.
Yes. This initiative did not materialize, and all the brave and courageous women of Lebanon, and Lebanon was in the lead. Samar Al-Hajj was the leader of our mission, along with representatives from various wide spectrum of civil society in Lebanon. There were Christians, people of other religions. I myself was from India. We were not able to take off because the Minister for Transport of Lebanon felt that if we were captured, the situation for Lebanon would be extremely awkward and would definitely involve Lebanon in a kind of hostility which the government of Lebanon, in the interest of peace in the region, desired to avoid.
How much is the Palestinian cause dear to the Indian people?
The Palestinian cause has always been dear to the Indian people. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years or more, a relationship was forged by our governments with Israel, which is a military and technology relationship. The fact is, we don't need that military and technology relationship. It is dangerous for India because certain episodes have taken place in India, certain attacks have taken place, where at the center of the attack was the Jewish Shabbat house. And some strange events have taken place in India ever since we forged this military and technology agreement. However, the people of India, right across India, our hearts have remained with the Palestinian resistance, following in the footsteps of Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi, who believed that Palestinian is the oldest anti-colonial struggle. And no country which has fought colonialism, which has fought British imperialism, which has fought Western imperialism, can be on any other side except the anti-colonial struggle against the Zionist entity in the Middle East.
Right. Professor Nilüfer Bhagwat, Attorney Vice President of the Indian Association of Lawyers, thank you very much for this participation in this special edition from India from the inside.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes, you're most welcome, ma'am. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. شكر جزيل لكل من ساهم في إنجاح هذه الحلقة، من حسين نصار، بسام خطار، ومني زينب الصفار. إلى اللقاء.